Okay. I wonder if I could have your attention, please. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to see such a crowd. I didn't quite know that we would do this, and we're very happy that we have. So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Kevin Hoover. I'm a member of the Economics and Philosophy departments here at Duke, and it is a really great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture by Professor Amartya Sen. Professor Sen's lecture is the keynote address in a program entitled The Uses of Economics, Past and Future. This program is a celebration of a landmark anniversary. The history of economics, not to be confused with economic history, that is, with the history of the economy, is a study of how economics as a field has developed. The first journal entirely devoted to the history of economics, the journal History of Political Economy, was founded at Duke in 1969, a little over 40 years ago. In part, this celebration marks those 40 years. But 40 years for a journal is hardly a landmark. Many academic journals are vastly older. The Proceedings of the Royal Society, for instance, have been published for more than 300 years. What is a landmark, however, is the fact that History of Political Economy has had the same editor, Professor Crawford Goodwin, for all 40 years. We know of no economics journal, and indeed no one has yet pointed out any academic journal, the editor of which has served such a long and distinguished tenure. So Crawford, would you please stand up and... Many of you, of course, know Professor Goodwin very well. But for those of you who do not, there's a brief biography in your program, and if you Google Duke, Hope, Goodwin, biography, you'll find a longer biography online. Let me just mention a few points. Professor Goodwin is a Duke institution, although I'm sure he'd hate to hear that. He's the James B. Duke Professor of Economics, and he came here as a student in 1955 and joined the economics faculty in 1962. He served in many administrative capacities, including chair of the economics department, vice provost for international affairs, and dean of the graduate program. And more relevant for today, working with a variety of colleagues over a long career, he's been the prime mover in the professionalization of the history of economics and in turning Duke into the world's leading center for the study of the history of economics. His extraordinary editorship of History of Political Economy has been a big part of that. Professor Goodwin is also a popular teacher, and the title of our celebration is drawn from the title of one of his most popular courses, The Uses of Economics. Before introducing Professor Sen, I'd like to acknowledge the people who have made this event possible. It's jointly sponsored by the Department of Economics and the Center for the History of Political Economy. And we've enjoyed the financial support of the President and Provost of the University, the Duke University Press, the Trent Foundation, the John W. Pope Foundation, the Office of International Affairs, and the Johnson Lecture Fund. And we thank the Duke Divinity School for the use of this very beautiful chapel. I'd also like to acknowledge the hard work of Paul Dudenheffer, the managing editor of History of Political Economy, and of Angela Zamanek, the administrative assistant in the Center for the History of Political Economy, in making this celebration work. So now on to the main event. Professor Amartya Sen is one of the most extraordinary intellectuals of our time. Professor Sen is the Thomas W. Lamont University Professor at Harvard University, and he was formerly the Drummond Professor of Political Economy and Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford University, and later the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge University. He's a Fellow of the British Academy and the Econometric Society. He's the past President of the Indian Economic Association, the American Economic Association, and the Econometric Society. He's received more than 80 honorary degrees from universities around the world, and he's been honored with numerous awards and prizes, including Bharat Ratna, the highest civilian award in India, and in 1998 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his contributions to welfare economics. Professor Sen's earliest work in economics dealt with abstruse topics in capital theory. His magnum opus, Collective Choice and Social Welfare, a book with sufficient mathematics to please any economic theorist, is at the same time a fundamental contribution not only to economics but to moral philosophy. Professor Sen's subsequent work has ranged widely over life's most difficult problems, from the most concrete and material needs of the body, how do we prevent starvation, as in his book Poverty and Famines, to the needs of the spirit, how should we live our lives, as in his Rationality and Freedom and the just published The Idea of Justice, which Hilary Putnam has called the most important work on this subject since John Rawls' Theory of Justice. So we're pleased today that Professor Sen is here with us, and pleased that he will address the topic fitting to our celebration, the uses and abuses of Adam Smith. Please welcome Professor Amartya Sen.
Well, I'm very happy indeed, and feel very privileged to be back at Duke, which I've been visited a number of times, always with very great pleasure. And certainly in this particular occasion, the celebration of the great editorship of Professor Goodwin of a very great journal, which he made it a great journal, History of Political Economy, is a wonderful occasion to come back to, an old favorite university of mine. So I'd like to thank the organizers of this meeting for giving me the privilege of coming here and taking part in the celebrations. The talk, as you know, is called Uses and Abuses of Adam Smith. When Adam Smith died in Edinburgh in July 1790, the reputation of the Scottish philosopher and economist was more secure in France than it was in England. Smith's ideas were often invoked by revolutionary authors across the Channel, such as the Marquis de Condorcet, one of the major philosophers of the French Revolution, and there can be little doubt that he was a very established figure in the French intellectual circles. To be sure, Smith's writings were well known in England as well. Even his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, published in 1759, just more than 250 years ago, had been widely read. Indeed, as David Hume wrote to Smith from London shortly after the publication of the book, I quote, "The public seems disposed to applaud your book extremely," unquote. However, while the French admirers of Smith's radical thoughts were already in some kind of an equilibrium about what his views actually were, the English image, which would emerge later, of a deeply conservative Smith, a mouthpiece of the unalloyed virtues of the market mechanism, allegedly articulated in his second book, The Wealth of Nations, had hardly been initiated. That image would emerge and become the standard view of Smith, from the radical to the conservative Smith, only in the decade following Smith's death. Even in 1787, only 3 years before Smith's death, Jeremy Bentham grumbled about Smith's inability to see all the virtues of the market economy, and took Smith to task in a long letter he wrote to Smith, arguing that Smith should leave the market alone, rather than criticize the market for its inability to control those whom Smith called quote-unquote prodigals and quote-unquote projectors, and that he should give up supporting state regulation of financial transactions. The debate has a very contemporary ring at that time, and Bentham included it in the second of the two prefaces in his defense of usury, criticizing Smith's inability to understand how the market economy works. Bentham may have missed the force of Smith's reasoning on this subject. Indeed, I believe he certainly did that. But his diagnosis of Smith's skepticism of the market was not mistaken. Before long, however, Smith would emerge in the image in which he is mostly seen in the standard view of Smith today as a political mouthpiece of simple slogans, mostly free market slogans, rather than as one of the finest authors of sophisticated theories of societies and economies, whose skepticism about markets was as firmly based as his insistence on the recognition of those good things that the markets do, and only the markets can do, amidst other features that need to be transcended. What Bentham had failed to do, making Smith an uncomplicated champion of pro-market capitalism through reasoning, would be achieved in the 19th century through faulty analysis of Smith's works and through selective citation, overlooking other parts of Smith's writing. That distorted image of Smith, which has been the source of so much abuse of Smith's ideas, would solidify in the century after Smith's death, that's in the 19th, and it came to be canonized in the 20th century. It remains the standard understanding of Smith today in mainstream economic textbooks and in daily newspapers, despite, I must note, protests from serious Smith scholars, pointing out that that is not indeed a right interpretation. Abusers of Adam Smith are at least as prevalent today as the users of his balanced argument for supporting a society with multiple institutions in the market would play its part, without being hostile to the important roles of other institutions, including those of the state. In Smith's analysis, those other non-market institutions can in turn play their part in, for example, providing public goods, like basic education, and offering economic support for the poor, in addition to doing something to regulate the market to the extent that it does require regulation. The three alleged quote-unquote lessons that are drawn by the champions of profit-based market capitalism from their reading of Smith are: first, the self-sufficiency and the self-regulatory nature of the market economy, the dominant belief, by the way, that we saw before the crisis hit here in the last couple of years. Second, the adequacy of the profit motive as the basis of rational behavior, through a theory of rationality as self-seeking. And third, the adequacy of self-interest as socially productive behavior. A different question. What is not just what the individual rational, but what is socially needed. In all these respects, the views were attributed that he took the view that the market economy was self-sufficient, self-regulatory, profit-seeking was the only kind of serious rational behavior, and ultimately socially productive. Arguments can, of course, be presented in favor of each of these claims, and there's something to discuss there. And what is important here, in the context of the subject of this lecture, is not so much to note that these arguments are hard to sustain, though I believe that is indeed the case, but to recognize that those arguments are not Smith's. Let me consider each of these wrong attributions in turn. Adam Smith never used the expression capitalism, as far as I have been able to find. But more importantly, there is nothing in his writings that would indicate that he believed in the self-sufficiency of the market economy. It's certainly true that Smith showed the usefulness and dynamism of the market economy in The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, in a way that had not been done by anyone earlier. And he also showed why and how that dynamism worked. Smith's causal investigation provided an illuminating diagnosis of the rationale of the market economy just when a much extended market system and its evident dynamism were powerfully emerging. and the contribution that the Wealth of Nations made to the understanding of this part of economics, among others, was absolutely monumental. And that is indeed part of our understanding of the market economy today. Straying from my script, even when Paul Krugman got his Nobel, the importance of integrating the economy of large scale, which was really what his technical work was about, was really an extension of Smith's analysis of that. I mean, there was a lot of technical work that needed to be done, which Krugman did, of course. However, even as the positive contributions of capitalism to the market processes and profit motives were being clarified and explicated, its negative sides were also becoming absolutely clear to Adam Smith himself. When a number of socialist critics, most notably Karl Marx, would present later on the case for censoring and ultimately supplanting capitalism, even to Adam Smith, the trailblazing exponent of the rationale of the market economy, the huge limitations of relying entirely on the market economy and only on the profit motive became totally clear, as we can see from his writings. I should note here, as a matter of some historical interest, that it is not at all surprising that Karl Marx was a deep admirer of Smith and saw himself as someone who followed and further developed the analysis that Smith had started. Given Marx's conviction, that conviction in particular, it's not surprising that Marx was very dismissive when John Stuart Mill, of whom Marx thought rather little. There's an asymmetry there. Marx clearly thought rather little of Mill. Mill clearly never heard of Marx, certainly never read any. So there's an asymmetry. But on the other hand, Marx is quite keen on his derogatory remarks on Mill, and he was quite skilled at that, of course. And that he was particularly upset when Mill claimed to be a follower of Adam Smith. It seemed quite a modest statement to me, but it angered Marx no end. He wrote this on that subject. This is in Capital, Volume 1. I quote from Marx: "John Stuart Mill, with his usual eclectic logic, understands how to hold at the same time the view of his father, James Mill, a close follower of Jeremy Bentham, and the opposite view. On a comparison of the text of his compendium, Principles of Political Economy, which is prefaced to the first edition, in which Mill announces himself as the Adam Smith of his day," this is a bit of an exaggeration, "we do not know whether to admire more the simplicity of this man or that of the public, who took him in good faith for the Adam Smith he announced himself to be. Although he bears almost as much resemblance to Adam Smith as Sir General Williams of Cars, quite a well-known character there, who failed to defend his fortress when it was attacked by Russians and capitulated quite quickly." And Marx, being quite an establishment comparison here, saying as much resemblance as Mill with Smith as General Williams of Cars to the Duke of Wellington, unquote. The revolutionary Marxist claimed to be the true disciple of the conservative Smith, quote unquote, does of course call for critical scrutiny. And yet, given Smith's skepticism of the market, it's not as incredible a thought as it would appear today to those reared in the contemporary mischaracterization of Smith as a great believer in no-nonsense capitalism. Consider Smith's analysis of the promoters of excessive risk in search of profit, whom he called prodigals and projectors, as I said earlier. This, by the way, is quite a good description of the dodgy entrepreneurs of credit swap insurance and subprime mortgages in the recent economic crisis. Smith's use of these terms was entirely pejorative. For example, by quote-unquote projector, Smith did not mean those who form a project, but specifically in its derogatory sense, apparently common from 1616, so I gather from Oxford English Dictionary, meaning, among other things, and I quote the OED again, a promoter of bubble companies, a speculator, a cheat, unquote. Indeed, Jonathan Swift's unflattering portrayal of projectors in Gulliver's Travel, published in 1726, 50 years before The Wealth of Nations, corresponds very closely to Smith's deployment of that word. In arguing against Smith's critique of the market economy, Bentham argued, among other things, that those whom Smith called projectors were also the innovators and pioneers of economic progress. As it happened, Bentham did not manage to persuade Smith to change his mind on this indictment, even though Bentham kept on hoping to have done just that, and in one occasion convinced himself, with actually very little evidence, that Smith's view on this has become, as a result of Bentham's argument, quote-unquote, at present the same as mine. All that evidence was that Smith was asked about him, and he said, you know, he's a clever guy, said Smith, a very intelligent man, and he's so polite, how could I be angry with him? That didn't mean that he was agreeing with Smith, and of course he didn't give any evidence that he was revising any part of The Wealth of Nations after hearing Bentham's criticism. Smith knew the distinction between innovating and projecting well enough. By the way, that is a very central issue in understanding what went wrong over the last 2 or 3 years. The big defense that came often is a kind of confounding of projecting activities, and if you want to stifle them, that you're stopping innovation. That argument goes back to Bentham in the 18th century, but I've heard it many times over the last couple of years, actually and earlier, for a decade, couple of decades, and over time when the regulations bit by bit have been taken away. Unwavering faith in the wisdom of the standalone market economy, which is largely responsible for the removal of established regulations in the United States, tended to assume away the activities of prodigals and projectors in a way that would have shocked the pioneering exponent of the rationale of the market economy, namely Smith. Indeed, as Smith warned, relying entirely on an unregulated market economy can wave the way for, I quote from Smith, a great part of the capital of the country being kept out of the hands which were most likely to make a profitable and advantageous use of it, and thrown into those which were most likely to waste and destroy it, unquote. There is furthermore much more in Smith's analysis on the role of the state in regulating markets, much more than that. Smith saw the task of political economy as the pursuit of, I quote, two distinct objects. First, to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such revenue or subsistence for themselves. And secondly, to supply the state or the Commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for public services, unquote. Smith saw the role of the state to include adequate provision of public services such as free education and to arrange poverty relief. Unlike Malthus, Smith did not reject the rationale of the poor laws. Rather, he thought the poor laws needed reform, in particular through allowing greater freedom, particularly of locational movement, for the indigent who received support than the rather punitive poor laws provided. Going beyond his investigation of the demands of a well-functioning market system, Smith was deeply concerned about the inequality and poverty that might survive in an otherwise successful market economy. Smith, indeed, even in dealing with regulations, in supporting some regulation and not others, that restrain markets, Smith saw the case for intervention in the interest of the poor and the underdogs of society. Indeed, at one stage, he gives a formula, what I can only describe as one of disarming simplicity. I quote from Smith: "When the regulation is in favor of the workman, it's always just and equitable. But it is otherwise when it is in favor of the masters," unquote. Underlying the plural institutional structure that Smith proposes is not only Smith's skepticism of the reach of the market, but his attempt to marry state intervention with the pursuit of the interests of the poor, which again and again recurs in his writing, as much in this Wealth of Nations as in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. I turn now to the second issue, the misinterpretation of Smith's views on the demands of rationality in human behavior. Smith did not, of course, argue that rational thinking is the basis of all our action. And he did give much room for emotions and sentiments in the narrower sense, though perhaps not as much as David Hume did. But he did think that even our instinctive reactions to particular conduct cannot but rely, if only implicitly, on our reasoned understanding of the causal connections between conduct and consequences in a vast variety of instances. And in the pursuit of reasoning, and this is the central issue here, a great deal more than self-interest and selfishness can and does come into Smith's investigation. Misinterpretation of Smith's analysis of reason for action has been a rampant feature of 20th century economics. The distorted standard view of Smith has been powerfully promoted by many writers who constantly invoke Smith to support their belief in the unique rationality of the profit motive. A great many economists were, and still some are, evidently quite enchanted by something that has come to be called, quote-unquote, the rational choice theory, in which rationality is identified with intelligently pursuing one's self-interest. If you do something for anyone else, this can be rational in this theory only if you get something, if not directly, indirectly, from it yourself. Following that odd, alienating presumption of modern economics, the alleged view of Smith, even though entirely implanted, have invaded neighboring disciplines as well. And a whole generation of rational choice political analysts and of experts in so-called law and economics have been cheerfully practicing the same narrow art. There's no room in this as if Smith for generosity or social commitment or public spirit, values the reasonable of which Smith discussed in very great length in the Theory of Moral Sentiment. I should mention that the Moral Sentiment, I was privileged to write an introduction, longish introduction discussing Smith's views, which came out in the anniversary edition, 250th year, 2009, compared to 1759, and it's published by Penguin. I go into these questions in greater detail than obviously I can here. The theory of, I cannot help saying, quoting myself here because I like it, though it's not a new thing. As I have argued elsewhere, I confess that while some men are born small and achieve smallness, it's clear that Adam Smith has had much smallness thrust upon him. The Theory of Moral Sentiment opens, in fact, with the following sentence, very first sentence. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it, unquote. I often grumble that economists don't read seriously, but it is quite interesting that it is not only the first chapter, first page, but even the very first sentence of the Theory of Moral Sentiment. Smith's analysis is further developed as the book proceeds, and he makes particular use of his thought experiment of the quote-unquote impartial spectator as a device for reasoned self-scrutiny, of which he thought reasoning human beings are perfectly capable. As Smith put it, I quote from Smith, "We can never survey our own sentiments and motives. We can never form any judgment concerning them unless we remove ourselves, as it were, from our natural station and endeavor to view them as at a certain distance from us. But we can do this in no other way than by endeavoring to view them with the eyes of other people, or as other people are likely to view them," unquote. Smith distinguishes with great sophistication the different kinds of reasons people have in taking an interest in the lives of others, separating out sympathy, generosity, public spirit, and other non-self-regarding motivations, each of which differs from the others, which he carefully distinguishes, and yet all of which have the implication of taking people away from the selfish pursuit of one's own interests only. There's nothing much in common between Adam Smith and the champions of rational choice theories, despite their nearly universal inclination to Smith invoked as their guru. I turn now to the third issue. Does this kind of broadening exercise help in building a good society, including a well-functioning market economy? And here we run into a further misinterpretation of Smith about human behavior, in particular about what kind of behavior is needed for a flourishing market economy, and going beyond that, for making the society good or acceptable. The question that remains is this: how could Smith's unambiguous emphasis on the need for going beyond self-interest and what he called, quote-unquote, self-love, have been so comprehensively neglected in a large number of economic treatises and textbooks? There is something mysterious about it, you have to concede. One reason for this confounding is a confusion between seeing the adequacy of self-interest in explaining a very narrow phenomenon, namely what motivates trade and what motivates people's inclination to participate in exchange and to seek trade, and in providing an understanding of the broader problem, what is needed for a good society, including proper functioning of the market economy. In answer to the first and the very limited question about the reasons for seeking trade, Smith famously observed that to explain the motivation for economic exchange in the market, we do not have to invoke any objective other than the pursuit of self-interest. In his most famous and widely quoted passage in The Wealth of Nations, very popular in mainstream economics as well as in law and economics and rational choice politics, certainly been quoted more than any other thing of Smith ever. Sometimes I think the reading had been confined to those 6 lines also. In those 6 lines Smith wrote, I quote, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest, we address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love," unquote. The butcher, the brewer, and the baker want to get our money in exchange for the meat, beer, and bread they make, and we want to get those commodities and ready to offer money for it. This is a fine point about motivation for trade, interesting in itself. But it's not a claim about the adequacy of self-seeking for the success of a society, or even of the market economy, or indeed even of the sustainability of trade. In the rest of Smith's writing, there are extensive discussions of the constructive role of other motivations that influence human action and behavior. For example, in the moral sentiment, Smith argues that while prudence is of all virtues that which is most helpful to the individual, I'm quoting here, "Prudence is of all virtues that is most helpful to the individual, humanity, justice, generosity, and public spirit are the qualities most useful to others," unquote. The working of a society goes much beyond the motivation for seeking trade, and even the successful operation of a market economy demands more than self-love. The nature of the present economic crisis illustrates very clearly the need for departures from unmitigated and unrestrained self-seeking in order to have a decent society. Even John McCain, the Republican presidential candidate in the summer of 2008, complained constantly about the greed of Wall Street being responsible for what's happened. Indeed, there is much evidence that has emerged powerfully in recent years in that direction, that motivational narrowness is an issue. The need in particular for a correction here, and The Wealth of Nations Smith illustrates his point with various examples as to why you need other motivation. This particular passage I'm quoting is about why we need trust as opposed to self-seeking, trust in other people. For example, he says, and this is one of the passages, Smith says, when the people of any particular country have such confidence in the fortune, probity, and prudence of a particular banker as to believe he is always ready to pay upon demand, such of his promissory notes as are likely to be at any time presented to him, these notes come to have the same currency as gold and silver money, from the confidence that such money can at any time be had for them, unquote. Smith discussed why such confidence need not always exist. Even though the champions of the Baker, Brewer, Butcher reading of Smith may be at a loss about how to understand the present economic crisis, since surely people, even bakers, brewers, and butchers today, have excellent reason to seek more trade, only far less opportunity. The devastating consequence of mistrust and mutual confidence and loss of mutual confidence would not have appeared puzzling to Adam Smith. And going beyond just the smooth working of the market economy, Smith also discussed the need for various institutions that can do what the market may not be able to achieve. He was deeply concerned about the incidence of poverty, illiteracy, relative deprivation that might remain despite a properly functioning market economy. And our determination to do something about these failures demands more than the pursuit of self-interest. I turn finally to a particular use of, I've been discussing abuses so far, but I now want to talk about a particular use of Smith's reasoning that has been, I believe, unfairly neglected in the literature of moral and political philosophy. The relevance of Smith's ideas for the theory of justice, I have argued in a recent book, The Idea of Justice, to which the chair kindly referred, goes well beyond the model of social contract pioneered by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, which lies today behind most of the mainstream theories of justice in contemporary philosophy, including the dominant contributions of John Rawls to what he calls justice as fairness. Indeed, even though the theories of justice and Rawls and Nozick and Dworkin differ, they share the same social contract basis. Unlike the social contract approach, Smith did not concentrate on defining quote-unquote just institutions, but paid extensive attention to the removal of injustice in the lives that people are actually able to lead, influenced by institutions, actual behavior, and other factors. Furthermore, unlike the contractarian theories of justice, Smith's attention is not confined only to what happens within a sovereign state, and it extends to global concerns. Adam Smith's invoking of the impartial spectator, to which I referred earlier, accommodates views coming from far as well as near, and this differs substantially from the admissible points of view on which social contract theories tend to concentrate, to wit the views of the people within a polity, within a sovereign state in which the contract is being made. And indeed there are writings even from my friend Thomas Nagel as to why global justice ends up being a chimera, because you need a sovereign state, and therefore as it exists only in nation states and there's no global state now. And that differs of course sharply from Smith's view. Even though in Rawls's discussion of moral reasoning, particularly for what he calls a reflective equilibrium, distant perspectives can be invoked, in his structured theory of justice and fairness, the relevant points of view are only those of the people in the society in which the so-called original position is being contemplated. He leaves, therefore, the role of what we do to others outside our borders to humanitarianism rather than demands of justice. Smith's defense of the impartial spectator leans towards an open impartiality, being open to people, views to people of everywhere in the world, in contrast with what can be called closed impartiality of the social contract tradition, with its confinement to the views of the parties to the social contract in a sovereign state, and therefore only to fellow citizens of that particular sovereign state. Rawls's focus in his beautifully developed and yet limited, as I'm arguing, approach of justice and fairness is on removing biases of a kind that is related to vested interests and personal slants within a given society. And it abstracts from invoking the scrutiny, in Smith's language, I quote, the eyes of the rest of mankind, unquote. Something more than an identity blackout within the confines of the local focal group would be needed to address what is left out. And Smith's impartial spectator is a very effective way of meeting just that need. There are in fact two principal grounds for requiring that the encounter of public reasoning about justice should go beyond boundaries of a state or a region, and these are based respectively on, one, the relevance of other people's interests, far away from as well as near a given society, for the sake of preventing unfairness to others who are not a party to the social contracts of the society, but whose lives are affected by our actions, and two, the pertinence of other people's perspectives to broaden our own investigation of relevant principles for the sake of avoiding under-scrutinized parochialism of values and presumptions in the local community. The first ground, related to the interdependence of interests, motivated Adam Smith to chastise the injustice of slavery anywhere in the world. Adam Smith made good use of the reach of global reasoning in many other economic analysis he takes up of diagnosable injustice across the world in each of his books. For example, the misdeeds of early British rule in India, including the disastrous famine of 1770, engaged Smith greatly in the Wealth of Nations. And he concluded that the East India Company not only, I quote, not only oppresses and domineers in the East Indies, but is altogether unfit to govern its territorial possessions, unquote. He was not in this drawing on any oddly devised social contract between the British and the Indians. It would have been very hard to fit the judgment in the contractarian framework, but on the kind of reach that the impartial spectator allows without confining judgments of justice within the limits of a sovereign state. In today's interdependent world, it's easy to appreciate the need to consider the mutual dependence of interests. Whether we consider the challenges posed by terrorism, or by global warming, or by the world economic crisis we are currently experiencing, confining our attention to national interests only cannot be the basis of understanding the demands of justice. Also, AIDS and other epidemics move from country to country and from continent to continent, and also on the other side, the medicines developed and produced in some parts of the world are important for the lives and freedoms of people very far away. Second, moving away from mutuality of the interdependence of interest, in addition to that feature, there is a further ground, that of avoidance of the trap of parochialism, for accepting the necessity of taking the open approach to examining the demands of impartiality, as Smith argues very pointedly. If the discussion of the demands of justice is confined to a particular locality, a country, or even a larger region than that, there's a possible danger of ignoring or neglecting many challenging counter-arguments that might not have come up in the local political debates or been accommodated in the discussions confined to the local culture, but which are eminently worth considering in an impartial perspective. Smith was particularly concerned about avoiding the grip of parochialism in jurisprudence and in moral and political reasoning. In a chapter entitled, I quote, and it's a revealing title, on the influence of custom and fashion upon the sentiment of moral approbation and disapprobation, unquote, in the theory of moral sentiments, Smith gives various examples of how discussions confined within a given society can easily be fatally limited by parochial understanding. He notes, for example, the fact that I quote, the murder of newborn infants was a practice allowed of in almost all the states of ancient Greece, even among the polite and civilized Athenians. Even Plato and Aristotle supported this practice. Smith goes on to argue that, I quote, uninterrupted custom had by this time so thoroughly authorized the practice that not only the loose maxims of the world tolerated this barbarous prerogative, but even the doctrine of philosophers, which ought to have been more just and accurate, was led away by the established custom, and upon this, as upon many other occasions, instead of censoring, supported the horrible abuse by far-fetched considerations of public utility, unquote. Scrutiny from a distance may be useful for practices as different as the stoning of adulterous women in Taliban's Afghanistan, selective abortion of female fetuses in China, Korea, and parts of India, and plentiful use of capital punishment in China, or for that matter, in the United States. It's interesting that in the comparison, if we make of 2008 data, I don't have the 2009 yet, that United States comes immediately after China, which is top executor, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. The relevance of distant perspective also has a clear bearing on some current debates in the United States. For example, that in the US Supreme Court not long ago on the appropriateness of the death sentence for crimes committed in a person's juvenile years. The question was whether you wait for him to become adult and then you execute him. The demands of justice being seen to be done, even in a country like the United States, cannot entirely neglect the understanding that may be generated by asking questions about how the problem is assessed in other countries in the world, from Europe and Brazil to Japan and India. There is an issue of jurisprudence involved here, and I'm privileged to give, actually in May, the Herbert Hart lecture in the law faculty in Oxford, where I want to go into that question a bit more. And even the claim of the argument of those who take the intent of the Constitution is what matters, not subsequent thoughts. We have to bear in mind how steeped in European thought the framers of the American Constitution were at that time, Jefferson and so on, were deeply involved in that subject. To say that therefore you could interpret it without seeing how these views have been interpreted in the rest of the world would seem to me to leave something really serious out. The majority judgment of the court in that particular case of crime committed in juvenile years actually ruled against the use of death sentence, very narrowly, by 5-4 majority. But there's every reason to think that the verdict would have been very different today, since the composition of the Supreme Court has changed, and the new Chief Justice Roberts had made clear that he would have sided with what had been the minority, and that more generally American judges should not be influenced by arguments presented and judgments made elsewhere, unquote. Are outside judgments really dismissible? In denying the appropriateness of capital punishment in this case, the majority of the Supreme Court did not simply quote-unquote, defer to like-minded foreigners, as Justice Scalia, who was against the majority verdict, suggested. Scrutiny from a distance can be an essential part of reasoning about jurisprudence, as Adam Smith analyzed, in order to arrive at grounded but non-parochial judgments, taking note of questions and arguments that considerations of known local perspectives can help to bring to focus. To avoid a misunderstanding, I'm not saying that you take the decisions taken elsewhere as something to emulate. You may decide to reject every one of them. It's a question of whether you consider those arguments or not, even though they have been outside the soil. As it happened, in public debate, the United States is quite open-minded in argument coming from elsewhere. And if I may take the liberty of saying, and been willing to listen from a whole variety of foreign-born people, from Jesus Christ to Mahatma Gandhi. It's only in the court we have a problem in dealing with that. I must stop here. I've argued that while the uses, indeed appropriate uses, of Smith's ideas are quite widespread and have certainly enriched the understanding of economics in particular and the social sciences in general, there are still things to be done. First, along with appropriate uses of Smith, there are also a great many abuses that have not only led to misunderstanding of what the founders of modern economics really said, the founder of modern economics really said, but have also helped to confound contemporary economic analysis, as the way that I've discussed, with far-reaching consequences even today, indeed very strongly today. This does need serious rectification. Second, I've also argued that there are additional uses to which Smith's ideas can be put that have been unduly neglected in the world of knowledge and understanding, particularly in political, moral, and legal philosophy. If avoidance of abuses is one necessity, further extension of fruitful uses of Smith is surely another. There is a great deal of life left in the thoughts of that remarkable thinker who published his first book as a very young professor at the University of Glasgow, just over a quarter of a millennium ago. The history of political economy includes, in this case, more than history. Thank you.
I don't know, is this mic live? Yes, okay. Professor Sen talked about listening to other people's views, and when I asked him whether he would take questions, he told me that that was actually one of his delights, to hear what people came up with and to sometimes be surprised by them. So we do have time for a small number of questions, and somebody just want to indicate that you have a question to ask. Since we don't have a mic out there, try to be loud and clear.
So you and Professor Goodwin have witnessed probably the apex of economics in its prestige relative to the other social sciences. Largely that's been due to its thoroughgoing mathematicization, and possibly it also has something to do with its utility to the powers that be, certainly the economic powers that be, over the same period. Where do you think economics will go now that it seems relatively clear, except to a few holdouts in Chicago, that rational choice and efficient markets aren't the most empirical sorts of assumptions to make, even if they do make the math easier? Will it become more like the other social sciences, more empirical but less broad in its predictions, or will it keep on serving capital, or will it do something else?
I have to walk around a bit because I've got metal knees, and they're very friendly to walking, but they're very unfriendly to standing stationary for some reason, which I have not been able to figure out why. But it's a very good question. But you know, let me say, first of all, I don't know where economics would go. And economics has never spoken in one voice anyway. I was criticizing, I did say there have been a lot of great uses of Smith. The fact that they're abuses doesn't rule that out. And certainly, you mentioned Chicago, and Chicago certainly has been a dominant influence, and I think that is probably likely to become less so. I mean, that particular view, Chicago also had many other, I think after all, if you read the founder of the Chicago School, namely Frank Knight, many of the arguments I presented today would not have come as a surprise to Frank Knight at all. It got narrower and narrower as time proceeded, rather than at the time of founding. And I hope that it might get broader and broader a bit, not just in Chicago, everywhere, because we do need broadening. And we need the use of other social sciences, absolutely. Now, I think you asked a question, but if there is a kind of implicit answer in your question that I see, I don't think I disagree on that. Where we might have something to argue with is what I think is the entirely irrelevant invoking. I'm not accusing you of irrelevant, but the standard fact is invoking mathematics in economics, which has got nothing to do with it. I think mathematics is a good tool to use for some problem, and a lousy tool to use for some other problems. So if one is using it intelligently, one would get somewhere. I mean, just to give the example, the two persons that I talk about mostly among theorists, Adam Smith and Marquis de Condorcet, in addition to Mary Wollstonecraft, in my book. Smith, of course, is a philosopher and a legal theorist, but not an economist, nor a mathematician. Marquis de Condorcet is a full-fledged mathematician, one of the leading lights of mathematics. And indeed, while he was propagating Smith's ideas in France, and between he and his wife, they translated substantial parts of The Wealth of Nations and The Moral Sentiment into French. I mean, he was doing it as a mathematician. He didn't see there's any problem there. So I don't think that either to blame, saying the problem of economics arises from greater use of mathematics. I don't think it does. I mean, sometimes it arises from going on to trivial problems, which may not be, it may not be transparent if you put it in mathematical form. There might be that. But the economist's tendency to discuss trivial problems, even when it's not mathematics, is quite well known and well established. So I think it seems a bit unfortunate to blame mathematics for that, really. I think we would continue, I hope we will continue to use maths in the way that proves right. And I don't think there's anything wrong in doing that.
It's been very useful for the prestige of the field, but as you say, it has tended to lead it in certain directions.
I think my complaint really, and that was going to be my second point, is the type of mathematics that have been more dominant in economics had not been well chosen. Now that's a different subject on which I did give a talk, which is meant to come out in a Congress of Mathematics in Rome. That is, economics was initially so influenced by physics and so on. I mean, when I was doing maths and economics in Calcutta, the maths I was totally comfortable with, of course, was differential equations and related things. So calculus of variation, and when Pontryagin came, those were not problems. On the other hand, the mathematical logic related thing, which came my way mainly when I got involved in social choice theory, had been neglected. And outside social choice theory, it has been very firmly neglected. Now the fact is, you mentioned about precision, but the fact is that a lot of the mathematical discussion, whether it's fuzzy sets or incomplete orderings, allow a level of imprecision which in a non-mathematical form, even in my book, Theory of Justice does, Idea of Justice does figure. And now that I'm jointly doing with Ken Arrow and Kotaro Suzumura, The Handbook of Social Choice Theory, we have substantial articles on fuzzy sets and incompleteness and so on. And so mathematics could help you to capture non-naturally specified forms in the way that physics had made us look, but take a more general approach that topology and other things allow you to do. But I think taking a hostile attitude to mathematics, or for that matter, earlier the worshipping attitude to mathematics, neither of them had a positive part to play. So I think if you and I were to argue on this, I think we probably come around to a similar position. I hope so anyway. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that was one good question. We probably have time for one more good question, or maybe two bad ones. But
On self-interest, I wonder if you could speculate on what made people like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi to act the way they did.
But sorry, who? People like who?
On self-interest.
I'm not.
Self-interest.
maybe step forward so you can hear you better.
You can come and whisper it to my ear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then you'll have to repeat the question.
Yeah.
On self-interest.
Yeah.
Self-interest. I wonder what self-interest drove people like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi to act the way they did, and also why people today we are worried with global warming if we always act for self-interest.
Yeah, but of course they were not acting in self-interest, and they didn't claim to be, and I don't think there would be anything to explain to Smith as to what they were doing, because still Smith did not think, indeed from the very first sentence which I quoted on the theory of moral sentiment, that that is the motivation that dominates us. So there will be no difficulty in answering or understanding why Mandela or Martin Luther King did what they did. I think the problem is for rational choice theory, but that's not Smith's problem, okay?
Okay, so one final question right here.
Thank you.
Tracing your legacy from Aristotle and Aristotle, you have defined development as freedom, and really freedom was the absolute freedom at the center stage of the development discourse. What I want to know is the way you have defined development in terms of expansion of human capability. What do you think would be the influence of the current trend of globalization on development as freedom?
You see, globalization has many components. We learn from each other. The world of science and mathematics and literature and music have immensely benefited from ideas and practices moving from one part of the world to another. So that's a very positive part of globalization. And a very positive part of globalization is also the prosperity that economic trade might bring, with which Smith was concerned. A very important part of globalization is also to have global critique of what's being achieved by the market economy. The anti-globalization movement, quote unquote, is one of the most globalized movements in the world. And it's based on people not complaining about local things, but traveling from Australia to Peru and from Mexico to Bombay to come and protest about what's happening in the globalized world. So that's a part of the thing. And indeed, David Hume, in 1770, in an essay called On Justice, says that the most important thing to recognize is that not only the trade has the effect of maybe producing economic changes of the kind that his friend Smith was pursuing, but it also makes it impossible for us to not consider the interests and point of view of others across the world. As he put it, as we come to have more and more connections with other people, the boundaries of justice ever grow wider. This is Hume. So I think that is a very big part of globalization that we have to look at. And that's also the reason, which I do discuss in my book, since Martin Luther King had come up earlier, when he says injustice, lack of justice anywhere in the world is injustice everywhere in the world. It's exactly the same point that David Hume is making. That is a point about the pro-globalization point, globalization of ideas, critique, understanding. The world has been influenced by Martin Luther King, by Mandela, by Gandhi and many others. But those are matters that would not have been possible but for our contact with each other and so on. So I'm going to emphasize that. Now, globalization, if it goes with inequality, then you have to address where the problem is, not with globalization but with inequality. And you have to ask how you could change that. This is exactly like the national question that Smith is saying. One of his most interesting passages is about the division of labor. He points out first why division of labor in economy of large scale is the reason for trade and the prosperity that's coming to the world. And then he proceeds to say, however, we have to bear this in mind, that it generates a world in which you may be engaged in doing exactly the same thing over and over again, tightening the same screw, in a way that Charlie Chaplin would make clear in modern times, many hundred years after Smith. And so he mentions also how it discusses class division. I was mentioning about the interest of Marx in Smith, but one of the ones which is a very extraordinarily important passage, which I do quote in my introduction to the theory of moral sentiments, is saying that why is it that some people seem intellectually inclined and not others, and why are the intellectually inclined people are often from well-off families? Now he rejects the hypothesis, this is the part of Smith which is not often recognized, that people are born with intrinsic differences. In fact, Smith was a nurturist of a vulgar kind. He believed that everyone is pretty much born with the same talents. And if you watch them, he says, in the very early days as an infant, very early days, you would not see any difference. But gradually, different upbringing, different schooling, different opportunities differentiate them. And then for the poor, the misfortune, the workman, as he put it, the misfortune is that they get very bad opportunity of education at home because they're they're continuing the tradition of neglect from which the family suffers, very bad schooling. And then they're working in the division of labor way into a kind of soul-breaking work, while others have an opportunity during their work to reflect on how to cultivate their minds and so on. It's a very interesting discussion of Smith. So what he's pointing out is that you don't say that therefore division of labor is wrong. He's saying it generates a problem. You have to recognize it. The same thing as I was trying to argue. He's saying not that market economy is wrong, but it generates the problem. How do you deal with it? That's the Smithian problematic throughout. And it relates to that question, that to say you don't have to be anti-market or pro-market, anti-division of labor, pro-division, anti-globalization, pro-globalization. You have to see what the good points are, what the bad points are, and in an intelligent, rational way to proceed what you can do about the bad points and how you might be able to discuss that. And if there's anything I'm going to predict about the future of economics, I would like it to go in that Smithian direction, not just a particular view of Smith. What? Yeah. Oh, totally normative. I'm most comfortable with them, I might say. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's with a lot of regret that I'm going to have to cut the conversation off here, but I would like to thank you all for coming and giving our celebration a rousing start, and let us again thank Professor Sen for his talk.